Hey, AP World History students, Mr. G here with one of my favorite topics, and that is feudal Japan. So let me get right to it. In class, some of you may have watched some of this or been involved in this, and we had talked about, some of these things while you're in class. And then I know for some of you might be watching this video, maybe in a review at some point, or some of you may be watching this as part of an assignment. So for those of you who are watching this as part of the assignment, you might remember we talked about the four major islands of Japan and how they play a crucial role. Geography and being surrounded by the sea has played a very crucial role for Japan. It keeps it isolated, but also it gives it a varied geography. It also is not very, it doesn't have a lot of open land for farming, but very mountainous in many places. We also talked about, and I'll just refocus on this, how Japan is centered on several major ideas off of this old national religion. It's part of Japan even today in some ways. It's called Shinto. And Shinto is centered around the idea of there being many gods, or it's very polytheistic, but they call these gods, they call him kami. That's the Japanese term. And you might have learned in World War II about these pilots that would commit suicide missions called kamikaze pilots, or pilots who had the godly or divine wind. And there's also some old ancestor worship involved in the Shinto religion. They do have a concept of a great creator. We'll talk about that in a second. There, at least during World War II, there was this idea of being very hyper nationalistic to the point where they believed Japan was holier than other countries. And of course, the idea of minimizing sin and guilt. So we were talked about, I mentioned this in one of the classes, that in some ways they would view something like dirtiness or lack of cleanliness as almost a sin. So in Japanese society, they're just like super uber clean and everything in their society. So that is the idea behind the Shinto vision of that. So another thing you'll see in Japan, you'll even see this in sometimes some Japanese restaurants in America, or you may see it in a Japanese gardens, if you will, here in America, is what we call a torii gate. So again, another Shinto idea, passing through these gates purifies you. So a lot of times heading into a neighborhood or a home, a business, or in this case, leaving the outside waters of Japan and returning to Japan on a fish from your fishing trip, you would pass through the torii gate as a purification, if you will. Again, another Shinto idea. And here's another torii gate in Hokkaido, which is the northern island of Japan. And as you can see, totally snow-covered driveway to know it gets cold in Japan, in the mountains and way up in the northern island. Here's another one. This is Amaterasu. Amaterasu is the sun goddess who they believe every emperor in Japan since is a son of or a descendant of this sun goddess. So this is why the Yamamoto clan is still around today. It's the longest ruling dynasty in world history, even though Japanese emperors today are kind of like a figurehead, kind of like the King of England is Charles. But Amaterasu, they believe, was the daughter of these two guys, Azanami and her husband Azanagi, who they believed bore Amaterasu to Japan. And they also believed that this couple created Japan by dipping a spear in the water of the Pacific Ocean, and out of that came four drops, which formed the four major islands of Japan: Hokkaido, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu. And there's some more lesser islands, like you may have heard of Okinawa, where Daniel-san from Karate Kid, his master, Mr. Miyagi, was from, right? This idea of the kami, it permeates a good portion of Japanese society, even though many Japanese, modern Japanese, kind of see it more as like a superstition, old legends type thing. They're very scientific minded, but some Japanese still adhere to this. And you'll see sometimes these tree kami or representations of it surrounding a tree through like origami art. But to give you a little background on the emperor or the idea of having an emperor in Japan, this goes back, I mean, somewhere in that, we're not 100% sure. We know it could be as early as the year 300 to as late as the year 710. By 710, we know this. There was an emperor on the island of Japan, and he was from the Yamamoto clan. And again, that dynasty still exists today. Unbelievable. But another thing is, early Japan was influenced by China, whether it was through voyages, whether it was through immigration, Confucianism in early Japan still played a role with that, submission to authority of an emperor, just like China also had an emperor. Japan did too. And the idea of a merit-based system, they tried it in Japan, but Japan just different, China, in order to advance higher nobility, you had to take the civil service exam, if you remember. But in Japan, you actually had to do, you had to be of noble birth, really, to get that high status. Very similar to how European feudalism was. You'll also see that Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism from China will transfer itself into Japan and then be practiced either mixed with or alongside Shinto with the kami. So you could have someone meditating like a Buddhist, but also adhere to the kami, which is Shinto. Or they'll be, I must be one with nature. But at the same time, they'll be into the beliefs of the kami or in the trees and things like that. So it's very interesting. So here is actually a picture of the current emperor of Japan here in 2023. His name is Naruhito, and he is supposedly a descendant of the first Yamamoto emperor from that 300 to 700 year period. Crazy. But you can see, of course, he'll wear modern Western dress. But here on the right side, you'll see him in the old Yamamoto era and Minamoto era Japanese traditional clothing. It's very interesting. But he really doesn't have any power anymore. At World War II, when we defeated Japan in World War II, one of the agreements that we had is that the emperor would no longer be worshipped as a god. We will allow Japan to keep him alive, and they will adopt a more Western style form of government like England has. They have a prime minister, a parliament, and everything like that. So by 794, things began to change a little bit in Japan. You'll still have the emperor around, but it's going to be dominated by a noble family called the Fujiwaras. So he'll become more of a figurehead. He's still there. He's still kind of worshipped, but he does not really have direct full rule over Japan. So that's where it really makes it different in China. China will continue full rule by its emperor all the way up into the early 1900s. But Japan kind of is going to come in and out of that a few times. So, but it's also during this time where Japan begins to kind of come into its own with a few things. And one of those is its own art and literature, especially what we call the Tale of Genji. The Tale of Genji was actually, we think, maybe the world's very first novel ever made. It was actually produced by a woman. Her name was Lady Murasaki Shikibu. It's about 1,000 pages long. And in that, it is very interesting because she would begin to use a type of script or writing that is not Chinese. It'll become eventually the actual Japanese script of writing. So for when she wrote it, it was just what women use, but eventually it's going to become all of it. I found that was very interesting. And it's also at this time, Japan will begin to kind of move away from China in religion, arts, government style. Confucianism kind of dies off completely, though they will still, develop and envelop Buddhism and Taoism into their Shinto religion there. But Japan will become more isolated. By the way, here's the court dress of the Heian period. You would see the people around the emperor dressed in such a fashion, whether the women on the left and the men on the right here, of course. And this is a copy. Of course, you could go right on Amazon today if you were so interested and purchase the very first novel we think ever made. And it was, of course, by a Japanese woman, Murasaki Shikibu. It's called The Tale of Genji. So there's that. And again, it is kind of ironic. This was written during a time when women were considered very, very, very low status in Japan, which education for women was highly discouraged by the Fujiwara clan. But it's a miracle that this got done. And today it's considered like, classic Japanese literature. It's pretty interesting. But again, the big thing to know with this, her novel is going to contribute a lot to the Japanese script known as what we call kana. The old script was called kanji, using Chinese characters. Men only wrote in that. Women wrote in kana. But today, most Japanese use kana. All Japanese, men and women. It's very interesting. The next clan to take over Japan was another one. Now, they were more militaristic than just pure noble. They were called the Minamoto clan. And they will see that there's a lot of corruption going on in the Heian court. And, they're going to keep the emperor kind of still as a figurehead, and probably even less power than during the Heian period. But they're going to kind of develop a feudal system very similar to what Europe has, with nobles and knights, what we also call samurai, and peasantry and everything. And it's going to be totally military rule, very militaristic. And you'll see this kind of as a theme in Japanese history, pretty much in and out, all the way up until World War II, where the Japanese militarists basically take Japan on the edge of its own extinction, fighting America and its allies. This is a map of Japan during the time when the Minamoto clan takes over. And you could see it was a group of different states with castles, very much like Europe in some ways. And each of these had to give its loyalty to the Minamoto clan. And Japanese feudal society, I would definitely memorize this structure. Definitely understand that at the top of the society, yes, I know the emperor, but the emperor, I want you to think he's kind of outside of this. He's a god. He is a figurehead, though. He is kind of reigning as God. He watches over it, but he does not really have full rule. Who really ruled were the shoguns, or the chief generals, right? They were kind of like a very top noble, if you will. And then lower nobles, but still high up, were daimyos. They owned their own manors as well. And then below them were lower nobles, but still very respected, highly honored samurai. They were very much like European knights, okay? And just like in Europe, you had a serf or a peasant class who did all the farming and all the harvesting of the rice and all that good stuff, okay? Remember, the emperor, high and above, reigns, but does not always rule. Actually, let me do this. That way you can go back and write that in there. There you go. So the emperor, high and above it all, in this social hierarchy in Japan, they reign as a god, high and above, but they're really not in the hierarchy, the social hierarchy, right? They don't really rule the day-to-day stuff. That's probably the best way to remember that. Japan has its own castles, not like your typical European castles, but they look just like these. Very Chinese in its inspiration, if you will, its influence. Here's another one at the gate of Hiroshima. If you're familiar with the city of Hiroshima, Hiroshima was bombed by the United States military during World War II. It was nuked, or an atom bomb was dropped on it. But a little bit more about this. It's a political, economic, and social system based on loyalty, holding of land, and complete military service. So basically, this whole idea in Japanese society, it is based on that. And the samurai warriors, this is the fill in there at the bottom, they're the ones who provide the police and military protection. Very similar to back in feudal Europe at the same time, how knights did the same thing, right? Very similar. And they were highly respected samurai. And there was a code, which they called Bushido, the way of the warrior, the way of the samurai. And at the top was honor. courage, loyalty, and living simply, doing things in simplicity, and very loyal to your daimyo, right? Showing absolute courage on the battlefield and having the honor and respect of the people. If you were to lose that, some of these guys would rather commit suicide than to live in shame of having no honor or no respect because they refuse to show courage or refuse to show loyalty to their daimyo or refuse to live in simplicity in all they do. Interesting, huh? Of course, you're going to miss some of the videos here that I was going to show in class, but later on in the year, when we get back to Japan, I'll do some more with this. But these are actual pictures from the 1800s, when we had film finally, of samurai who were still alive in the 1800s, of getting ready to commit seppuku, which is a form of ritual suicide if they feel in some way that they're defeated and they have shame in that defeat. They rather commit seppuku as an honorable way to die. This way, the samurai, especially if he fails his master or his daimyo or his shogun, and he was disloyal, so it is better to thrust a dagger into your abdomen and then be decapitated in your, as it's called here, your daishaku, your last seconds, if you will, and your fellow samurai would come and decapitate you with a katana sword after they have poured water on it. And that way you're not suffering from the dagger that's in slow death, by the way, in your stomach, and they will quickly put you out of your misery. Very alien mindset to the Western way of thinking, but again, this is what they believe, and this is what they did. This is a full samurai attire. Looks very bulky, I don't know. But maybe it'd be harder to get a sword through all of that. I don't know. I mean, they did not use metal armor like European knights did. But I'll tell you what, these katana swords that they used, I've seen a few firsthand today. They're incredibly sharp. I've actually seen demonstrations of these used where they can cut straight through watermelons and cantaloupes and with ease. And it is said that one samurai sword's fell swoop can chop off 4 heads at once. Yeah, wild stuff. And here are some drawings from the 1000 to 1400 time period of samurai warriors. They were also great horsemen as well. There were horses in Japan. Here's them on the ground. They were also great infantry as well, so they could fight on horseback as well as on foot. And here are some modern reenactors, of course, I am sure, of course, samurai, being a samurai now is illegal in Japan ever since the late 1800s. But there are plenty of reenactors that still love to dress up in this way and pose with the tourists. Probably another thing to bring up about early Japan is this creation of a Japanese form of Buddhism, which we call Zen Buddhism. So they took in Mahayana Buddhism, mixed it up with Chinese Taoism, and then you practice it alongside Shinto as well. And for many who had been Shinto for many years, when they took in Japanese Buddhism, they really loved the idea of the mental and self-discipline that came along with Buddhism and the meditation aspect. And so with the samurai, many did practice Zen Buddhism alongside the respect for their kami and Shinto. And many Zen Buddhists for meditation have created probably one of the most beautiful gardens in the world. You can actually see some of them here in Florida. I went to one. I believe it was called Cedar Gardens up near Gainesville. There's a beautiful one up there. And of course, on the east coast of Florida, I think around West Palm area, there's probably one of the best ones in the country. When Trump was president and the Japanese prime minister was here visiting, Trump and Melania took the prime minister and his wife to see that one over there. So it's very beautiful. It's a place you can go and relax, and there are bonsai trees and lots of stuff. What is another thing that saved Japan? Well, you'll learn about these group of people called the Mongols, who eventually did take over China, Korea, and a good portion of Asia, as well as parts of Europe. They never were able to take off Japan. And it's because, and they tried too, they got into like 4,000 something ships with 140,000 Mongol warriors to go take over Japan. And somehow this typhoon, which in this part of the world you would call a hurricane, blew up and it crashed the ships, destroyed them, and dashed them. And the Mongols were never able to get to Japan and fight and take it over. And that event kept Japan closed off from the rest of the world and kept them from being conquered like the rest of Asia did. It's very important because it's going to keep their culture, in their view, very pure and untainted by anybody else. So that's a really important point to know. And in many ways, the Japanese will say it was the kamikaze winds that came and destroyed the infidel or the unbelieving Mongols, right? The kami sent the winds, right? So, all right, finally, Zen Buddhism and Shinto in Japanese cultural traditions. Here's a couple examples. What they call shonoyu, it's a Japanese Zen Buddhist tea ceremony that they do, which is usually pure green tea, by the way. And you can see here's the green tea. It's probably the best that you can get in the world, especially in some ways. Sometimes it's used as a way to focus on something you're getting ready to do, or maybe you've fallen in love with somebody and you want to share that tea with them as a way to, build a oneness of mind with each other. Origami actually originally was done as a form of meditation and helping you focus. It's very Zen Buddhist / Shinto. And here's some modern adaptations. If you like Star Wars, here's a Jedi warrior origami. There's a chicken and the egg one. And there's a nativity at Christmas with the wise men and baby Jesus. And it looks like a couple dinosaur ones. So people really gotten into this origami. There's also something called ikebana. It's the art of meditational Japanese flower arranging. This is another Zen Buddhist thing to do. And each flower height represents something. Like the tallest flowers represent heaven, the middle ones represent man or humankind, and the smallest represent the fact that we're standing on the earth. And it helps you focus and remember that and know your place in the world, things like that. You also may have heard from, if you've watched any of the Karate Kid films or Cobra Kai, right? And Mr. Miyagi and Daniel's son are lovers of bonsai trees and the art of bonsai clipping and stuff. It's a form of meditation. It teaches you focus. It teaches you precision and stuff like that. So that is also something. You may have seen bonsai trees. So unfortunately, I don't have time to show you this, but in class, we'll get to watch the greatest lesson of Mr. Miyagi, who is Japanese Zen Buddhist and Shinto on his view of staying focused. So, and I want to say, as I finish up this lesson, thank you very much, or as you would say in Japanese, domo arigato. Thank you very much. So that's it. Hopefully this helped to get you understanding a little bit of early Japanese history. We're going to learn a lot more about Japan a couple different times later this year, but hopefully this was awesome and you enjoyed it. So take care and God bless you.